Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Solace Global Risk Outlook for 2026. A lot of familiar faces, so thank you very much for joining after the new year. Just to give you a brief overview of today, these topics are part of our 2026 Outlook and therefore slightly more broader in their risk and security outlook, although there will be some more tangible elements, especially for the coming quarters. But stepping back a little bit on some of these topics to look at 2026 as a whole. You'll recognise the panel from the last sessions, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves one by one. Mark.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Overington, Head of Intelligence here at Solace Global.
I'm Josh. I'm an Intelligence Analyst here at Solace.
Hi, I'm Julian, and I'm a Senior Intelligence Analyst here at Solace.
Good afternoon. I'm Manfredi. I'm also an Intelligence Analyst here at Solace Global.
Thank you all. The topics today, Julian will be covering the conflict in Yemen and security in the Arab Peninsula. Josh will be covering Islamic State in Africa. Manfredi will be covering Bangladesh. You will have noticed that Bangladesh has cropped up a couple of times in the last 9 to 12 months on our risk outlook, and some of our risk reports. Remains a hot topic with a number of our clients, so Manfredi is going to give us an update. And Mark will talk to us about the growing threat of physical attacks on critical infrastructure. To that end, I'll hand over to Julian, who will look at the conflict in Yemen. And Julian, probably best to, at the minute, sort of set the scene on the Yemen civil war, who the main actors are and where things stood in 2025 and your thoughts for 2026.
It's now been over 11 years since the Yemen civil war began. And this was between the internationally recognised government, or IRG, which was backed by a Saudi Arabia-led coalition, with the Houthi movement, who was sponsored by Iran. And it's been almost 4 years now since a ceasefire was brokered in 2022, which, although this has formally lapsed, has de facto held since. So 2025 actually saw this de facto ceasefire come under likely the most strain since 2022. This is due to Houthi aggression in the region, and the aerial campaigns that were conducted against the Houthis. So in March 2025, after a pause since the January Gaza ceasefire, the Houthis announced a resumption of their anti-merchant shipping campaign. Now, this was a campaign which is estimated to have disrupted over $1 trillion in global trade. And they also conducted a campaign of long-range attacks against Israel. The US, subsequent to this, began Operation Rough Rider with UK support. And this involved a large-scale campaign of strikes against Houthi-controlled Yemen. Now, very importantly for regional security, international media was briefed at this time that UAE-backed Yemeni factions were planning a potential ground offensive against the Houthis, reportedly with the advice of private American security contractors, and the UAE itself reportedly raising the plan with US officials. Now, these UAE-backed Yemeni factions, that almost certainly referred to the secessionist Southern Transition Council, or STC, and its allies. So for the STC, they emerged from the South Yemen secessionist movement and controlled Aden, where the leadership of the IRG, called the Presidential Leadership Council, was headquartered, or is still headquartered. So despite holding the ultimate goal of establishing an independent state, the STC entered into a power-sharing agreement with the government and sat on the Presidential Leadership Council. With significant backing from the UAE, the STC and its allies were considered to have actually some of the most capable forces in the anti-Houthi coalition. Now, this talk of a ground offensive that I mentioned during the US campaign, that lowered following the mediated ceasefire between the US and the Houthis in May. And the Houthis ultimately stopped their campaign against merchant shipping and Israel following the Gaza October ceasefire.
Thanks, Julian. And in December 2025, the situation dramatically changed. What did the STC offensive and the government counteroffensive mean for the stability of Yemen?
I would argue that December 2025 almost certainly saw effectively the most significant power shift in Yemen since at least 2022, probably going back to 2014. So what happened was the STC, the secessionist group, launched an offensive against the Saudi-backed government, and they seized broad control of southern Yemen, as you can see in the maps here. With this offensive, the SEC successfully established control over territory which covered most of the pre-1990 Yemen unification state called South Yemen. So this left the power-sharing agreement with the government in tatters. It left the IRG with only limited remaining territory and set the conditions for this independent state of South Arabia. Now, crucially, An SDC official actually stated at this time that the secessionists were consulting with partners again on potentially pursuing a ground offensive against the Houthis. What happened then again dramatically changed the balance of power. So early this month, the Saudi-backed National Shield forces launched a counter-offensive, and this not only led to them recapturing the territory lost to the SDC, but ultimately led to the broad capitulation of SDC forces across its previous territory, including in Aden. Now, the Royal Saudi Air Force assisted the counter-offensive. Notably, they actually did strikes against a shipment of military hardware from the UAE in Mukalla, and the UAE subsequently withdrew all of its remaining forces from Yemen. So in the aftermath of all of this, Saudi Arabia invited the SCC leaders to Riyadh for talks. However, while some attended, the SCC's president instead fled to Abu Dhabi. And I think this conditioned what happened next, which was an STC Secretary General who did go to Riyadh made a statement that the STC is disbanding. But this was then disputed by an STC spokesman from Abu Dhabi.
And those that are old enough to remember the Arab Spring will see consistencies and inconsistencies from partners in the region. How does Saudi and UAE approaches to Yemen differ at the moment, and why does that matter going forward for regional stability?
The first major consequence from what's happened in Yemen for the broader Arabian Peninsula that I wanted to highlight is that this has made likely the biggest rift in decades between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And I would argue that these divisions arose from competing strategic priorities and risk tolerances for intervention in the region. So on the one hand, we have Saudi Arabia, and they accrued considerable reputational and economic costs during their intervention against the Houthis. And it's very likely that Riyadh is reluctant to re-engage in any further conflict with the Houthis. Currently, Saudi Arabia is still pursuing its ambitious Saudi Vision 2030 project, which seeks to diversify its economy. And this is a mission that's deemed critical to Saudi Arabia's long-term survival and influence as the world very gradually transitions to carbon-free energy. And in the last few years, Saudi Arabia has therefore pursued a policy of regional de-escalation. It's effectively ended its Cold War with Iran. And in Yemen, it's maintained a keen willingness for diplomatic efforts with the Houthis, despite the significant challenges. On the other hand, we have the UAE, and they have likely had a far higher risk appetite for renewed conflict in Yemen. So it's been willing to empower the destabilizing STC in pursuit of these objectives. The UAE does share similar economic priorities as Saudi Arabia, but Abu Dhabi is firstly less vulnerable to chaos in Yemen, and I'd argue that Abu Dhabi has sought to pursue greater long-term regional stability through riskier intervention, accepting the costs of short-term instability to address long-term sources of instability, namely the Houthis. So since entering Yemen over 10 years ago, the UAE has consolidated control through the STC, built up broad control and influence of strategic locations around the Gulf of Aden. But with the recent developments in Yemen, the UAE likely lost in just a few days what it took a decade for them to create.
Could the civil war at this point, Julian, with the Houthis escalate again in 2026? And I suppose the question is what spillover risks are possible across the Arabian Peninsula for those that maybe have businesses in the region, etc. So what's your thoughts on that?
In terms of security, I think the main risk factor for the wider Arabian Peninsula remains the Houthis. A reignition of the civil war would not only dramatically change Yemen's security environment, but pose considerable risks of Houthi long-range attacks in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So during the civil war before, up to 2022, the Houthis regularly launched attacks against military sites, oil infrastructure, and international airports in Saudi Arabia. Initially characterized by rockets and unguided missiles, later the Houthis used sophisticated Iran-developed missiles and long-range one-way attack drones. Also, by 2022, the Houthis were also conducting attacks against the UAE. Just one attack, for example, in January of 2022, struck fuel trucks near Abu Dhabi's international airport and killed 3 civilians. So in 2026, I think there are multiple high-risk scenarios that could play out. With the recent developments having introduced considerable volatility to Yemen. In terms of a higher impact scenario, we could see the continued fragmentation of the anti-Houthi coalition between the disparate range of armed groups that operate there. I mean, just for one, the status of the SCC, although apparently defeated, as I mentioned before, there are already indications of an emerging split. And the fracture or the dissolution of the SCC does not mean an end to the southern cause, nor the sudden disappearance of the SCC's fighters. At the more extreme extreme end, we could even see the emergence of an insurgency by radical STC splinter groups. Chronic instability and infighting in southern Yemen would reduce the chances of a peace settlement with the Houthis. There would be a lack of a coherent negotiation partner, and there would be diminished incentives effectively for the Houthis to compromise. A lower impact, but still problematic scenario would be with the Presidential Leadership Council with Saudi support successfully integrating all these factions under this newly formed Supreme Military Committee. And now this seeks to monopolize the force in the anti-Houthi coalition under one military command. Now, this still poses risks for the peace negotiations of the civil war, because the stated purpose of this committee is ultimately to be a vehicle to defeat the Houthis. And Houthi supporters have already expressed concern about the potential for a unified enemy. So I think 2026 will likely pose further tests to the de facto ceasefire, and progress made in the peace negotiations are crucial for regional security. Despite their degradation from the US and Israeli campaigns, the Houthis likely go into 2026 still in a stronger position to conduct long-range attacks than in 2022. So fundamentally, a further resurgence of conflict in Yemen in 2026 would pose threats across the Arabian Peninsula. And I think this really emphasizes the continued importance for organizations and businesses to operate in the broader region to monitor for events in Yemen.
Julian, thank you. Appreciate that. I'll come to Josh for Islamic State in Africa. A good place to start is probably why is the Islamic State expanding in Africa at the moment?
Primarily, Africa provides numerous countries with weak governance, ongoing security vacuums with poorly equipped security forces, and limited intelligence and border control capacity, which can be easily exploited by insurgent groups. So Africa has become IS's most active operational theatre since its territorial defeat in 2019. According to its propaganda, about 90% of its attacks take place there, and its propaganda has majorly shifted focus to Africa in recent years. So in the first half of 2025 alone, IS's African branches claimed at least 565 attacks across 8 different countries. And while the groups are semi-autonomous, it continues to rely on the command structure in the Middle East, which provides operational support, funding, and strategic guidance.
Where are specifically the ongoing insurgencies and how they developed in 2025?
So there are 5 separate IS provinces. So firstly, you've got IS Sahel province, which is primarily active in the Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso tri-state border region. It's conducted dozens of attacks through 2025, primarily exploiting the Western force withdrawals and the taking over of Russian assistance through Wagner and subsequently Afrika Korps. It targeted civilians and security forces alike, burning and looting homes while seizing several key corridors, while also portraying itself as an alternative guarantor of security to the civilians in the area. One notable development the group has resumed is high-profile kidnappings of foreign nationals. This is something that it hadn't done since 2018, but it's since restarted that. It's been outsourcing it to local bandits mostly. One of the most active provinces of Islamic State is Islamic State West Africa province, which is primarily centered in the Lake Chad Basin region. Its main areas of operation, however, are Nigeria and Cameroon. It has been particularly active, claiming 215 attacks and 734 casualties in Nigeria in the first half of 2025. It's particularly exploiting the porous borders in the region, particularly since Niger's exit from the multinational joint task force. Has targeted Christian villages, but particularly it's been effective at targeting Nigerian security forces, which have struggled with the ongoing insurgency. To counter ISWAP, they have conducted these things called super camps, where they concentrate military forces into camps that are heavily fortified. However, ISWAP has conducted a burning camps campaign, specifically targeting these camps through nighttime raids. There's also a high prevalence of foreign fighters in the group, suggesting increased external funding and support from the Middle East. So the only group that's had significant setbacks in 2025 is Islamic State Somalia. which is widely considered to be a major financial node in the wider IS network, which is perhaps why the US has been so active in supporting Somalia's counter-terrorism operations. It's got the high presence of foreign fighters. It's got an estimated between 700 and 1,500 total fighters. Approximately half of these are foreign, suggesting again a funneling of resources to this province. However, it's suffered major setbacks in 2025 through the Puntland Regional Forces offensive, which has been backed by US logistical aid, training, and air and ground supports. And this was matched by a significant decline in attacks. Next, you have Islamic State Central African Province, which is split into two. Firstly, in the DRC, the group waged a particularly brutal campaign through 2025, targeting civilians in villages, churches, funerals, and hospitals. This has largely been driven by the operational freedom given to them by the ongoing M23 insurgency, which has distracted Congolese forces. Several high casualty massacres have taken place, notably the killing of 70 Christians inside a church in February and another 71 in a funeral in September. The group also attempted an attack in Uganda, which was foiled by Ugandan security forces. Then finally, you have Islamic State Mozambique province, or ISMP. It's been traditionally confined to the Cabo Delgado region. However, it's since extended its operations south into two border provinces in 2025, conducting looting and abductions, as well as displacing approximately 350,000 people in the second half of 2025. This was an increase of 100,000 over the same period a year prior. Ultimately, that's the main five, but they do have small cells elsewhere in other countries, such as Morocco.
What is the significance of the US Christmas Day strikes in Nigeria?
In recent months, we've seen comments from US President Donald Trump regarding an ongoing Christian genocide in Nigeria. He's previously threatened airstrikes and troop deployments to deal with the issue. Guns are blazing. The thing with Nigeria is it's actually struggled with multiple ongoing insurgencies. So you got two Islamic State provinces. You got ISWAP in the northeast and ISSB in the northwest. You also have Boko Haram in the northeast, as well as lots of ongoing banditry in the northwest. So Nigerian security forces are severely overstretched, and it's highly likely that Nigeria requested help from the US. So on Christmas Day, the US conducted strikes on Islamic State Sahel province in Nigeria's northwest, in Sokoto state. Now, this is quite notable because it kind of diverges from Trump's comments regarding Christian genocide. A lot of the targeting of Christians in Nigeria happens in the northeast from Boko Haram and ISWAP. However, this suggests that it's more to do with US establishing a counter-terrorism presence in Nigeria. US attention has increasingly pivoted towards West Africa, particularly following other Western countries' withdrawal. For example, France's withdrawal from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad, leaving Western presence in the region severely diminished. US presence in Nigeria would provide an operational base potentially near the Sahel to counter the growing IS threats there.
Thanks, Josh. And looking forward, what's the likely development of the ongoing insurgency, so people can start to just obviously look at where they've got to have their own operations, etc.?
The groups are highly likely to continue to expand through 2026. ISSP is likely to continue to expand, particularly in Niger, where JNIM has slightly less of a presence. JNIM is a rival Al-Qaeda affiliated group in the region. For ISCAP, particularly the DRC one, they're likely to be driven further west as Ugandan forces increase their operations to push them away from the border. So we may potentially see attacks in the Shopo province, which we haven't really seen yet, where the group can exploit limited state presence and favorable terrain to support its operations. In March 2024, Ugandan security forces were placed on high alert after they received intelligence that ISCAP fighters crossed the border from the DRC. They obviously attempted an attack in 2025 that was unsuccessful. However, it's highly likely that they will try again. So we may see more attacks in Uganda emanating from ISCAP. Islamic State Mozambique province likely to entrench itself in new areas south of Cabo Delgado, and ISWAP is poised to maintain its attack tempo, likely with continued external support, use of drones, that kind of thing. It can also present itself as a regional alternative to Boko Haram. Boko Haram are particularly brutal. They target Christians and Muslims alike, whereas ISWAP is more focused on targeting Christians. So many Muslims in the area are at risk of being targeted by Boko Haram, whereas ISWAP can present itself as an alternative force to join or support. Finally, you have Islamic State Somalia, which has been severely weakened through the Oulook offensive, which has now reached its end. So it's likely to be supported by a potential influx of fresh fighters through Somaliland, particularly given ISS's operational importance to the group. This may also result in further high-profile attacks in other major capitals. And finally, we may see the potential for the formation of a new IS province. One potential country for this is Sudan. Obviously, the Sudanese civil war has left it as one of the most conflict-ridden and unstable countries in the world. A July 2023 UN report noted that there's already an IS financing and logistics network in Sudan of between 100 and 200 people. In 2025, IS propaganda has encouraged Muslims from Egypt and Libya to join the IS in Sudan. It then later on reiterated this call, which suggested it may not have been uptaken. Islamic State Sudan province could have severe wider implications given its strategic location, link the North, East and Central Africa, and with access to the Red Sea, which would provide IS with an invaluable hub for African operations.
Josh, thank you. Manfredi, I'll just bring you forward for Bangladesh, the elections and the transition to a new government.
It is definitely very important to talk about Bangladesh today and to talk about Bangladesh again, because the country is approaching what might be one of the most important days, at least for its short to medium term future. On the 12th of February, Bangladeshi citizens will vote in the first elections since the July 2024 revolution that toppled the government of Sheikh Hasina, who had been in power for 15 years. And we'll also vote on the July Charter, which is this political reform project that was approved by 30 parties within the Bangladeshi political system. For context, in between July and August 2024, Bangladesh had a student-led revolution, one of the major Gen Z protests that we've seen in the past 2 years. This protest, which originally started because of complaints against a new quota system for government jobs, eventually developed into a nationwide protest against government corruption, which forced Hasina to escape into exile and basically toppled the long-standing government of her party, the Awami League. The revolution, of course, has created a completely new political environment with this interim government led by Nobel Prize winner Mohammed Yunus as a chief advisor of the country, and supported by a variety of different parties that are supporting this reform, this constitutional reform project. The elections have been debated for more than a year. All parties knew that they were going to happen, but each one of them had a different program and a different schedule, a different way that they had preferred the elections to occur. And now finally we're approaching this date, the 12th of February. There are dozens of parties, but I've decided to select three main players. One of them is the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party, the BNP, which is sort of the long-standing big tent opposition party to the Awami League. Historically, it has been the second or the first biggest party throughout Bangladesh contemporary history. It is now polling first. However, as you can see in the poll graph, the polls have been sort of all over the place. It is very difficult to actually ascertain the actual level of support that these parties have. Despite this, the BNP is widely considered to be the front runner in the polls. The second party is Jamaat, JI, is the largest Islamist party in Bangladesh. is sort of running on the back of having won some key victories in the student council polls in Bangladesh, and it has sort of also sought to moderate some of its more conservative stances, also to appeal to religious minorities. And finally, there is the National Citizens Party. This is really the student-led party, and it's the newest party in the Bangladeshi political scene. However, this party has faced some important difficulties, basically difficulties in organizing. And in fact, just one of the latest headlines regarding the party is that 15 senior leaders have stepped down. So it's an extremely contested election. It is still unclear what the equilibrium, the balance of power will be after the elections, but it will be an extremely important vote. On the 12th of February.
Just going into sort of more of a security perspective, what factors are affecting security in Bangladesh ahead of the elections? And I suppose, is this security situation worsening or improving? Just to give people a general idea.
Since the revolution, the security situation in Bangladesh has very much worsened by several different factors. Firstly, there has been a spike in crime. The reason why there has been a spike in crime that the government has recognized is because of a severe weakening of the police force after the revolution. The reason why is that Hasina's Awami League basically co-opted the police force via a system of clientelism. The end of that government resulted in a severe manpower shortage, as several officers and officials within the police were either removed or left force. In some cases, there were shortages of up to 30% of the personnel. So this spike in crime has been accompanied by severe political unrest. As you can see in the second graph, there has been a notable spike for the dates between 2024 and 2025 in mob violence, reaching almost 300 deaths in 2025 alone because of mob violence. In this case, student groups have been particularly at the forefront of staging mob and political violence. Often, in many cases, the violence has also occurred not just between different parties and different political groups, but also within the parties themselves, as different groups try to jostle for political control and also for economic control over local industries, local administrations, local police forces. So this vacuum, this political vacuum that has been left by the fall of the Awami League, has now been, the various parties are competing to fill it and creating an environment that is very conducive to violence. Finally, there is the question of socioeconomic issues. Before the revolution happened, Bangladesh was already going through a period of economic crisis. In 2023, there were a severe strike by garment manufacturing workers. Of course, the garment manufacturing sector is an extremely important sector for the economy of Bangladesh. And the revolution has complicated these sectors and also in general the economy, for example, by increasing security threats in the manufacturing plants themselves. While the exact number is difficult to assess, some statistics point to the fact of hundreds, more than 300 manufacturing plants may have closed in Bangladesh as of November 2025. This is especially an issue for the manufacturing sector, and this has created tens of thousands of newly unemployed people, particularly women, who constitute the backbone of the manufacturing sector in Bangladesh. So there are definitely several different factors that are contributing to making this elections extremely unstable and the election campaign also extremely violent.
Thank you, Manfredi. And I suppose the big question is, will the elections result in greater stability in Bangladesh, or is insecurity likely to continue affecting Bangladesh economy and politics going forward?
This is difficult to say. There are several factors that might affect whether or not the elections and the referendum will create an environment that is conducive to stability. The first is simply whether or not the elections and whoever wins them is perceived as a legitimate government. That is, if the parties that then enter the opposition accept being at the opposition and accept having a secondary role in shaping the political agenda and the agenda setting in the future of Bangladesh, or if they do not. Several parties have been competing, as I said, in this spoils system, and might not be willing to relinquish their positions and their newfound ground. However, even just outside of the political developments themselves, there are several factors. Firstly, as I explained, the question of socioeconomic issues. They're not just the labor issues that have been developing in Bangladesh for the past few years, but also the latent impacts of the revolution. I've mentioned the fact that the revolution has posed a security threat to the manufacturing plants. Well, this has resulted in several international companies, international manufacturers, looking for other countries in which to establish new plants or in which to re-establish their operations following the revolution, most notably India and Pakistan. In this sense, these developments are not just in the hand of the Bangladeshi people. For example, well, in January, the European Union and India are close to striking an important trade deal that might lower tariff barriers on garment imports from India. So, of course, if that trade deal passes, that will make it much more appealing for international players to set up factories in India rather than Bangladesh. There are other important factors. For example, the global tariff regime with geopolitical impacts affecting the US and China has also impacted exports from Bangladesh. So not all of the cards are in the hand of the future Bangladeshi government. And finally, I would point to the fact that outside of these socioeconomic and political impacts, there are other security issues that have not been resolved in Bangladesh in the past few years. One that is important to mention is the Chittagong Hill Tracts insurgency, which has been in a sort of this precarious peace since the 1997 peace deal. However, since 2022, there's this new ethno-nationalist separatist group, the KNF, which has increased the tempo of operation, and the interim government has tried to somewhat contain it, and most notably with a large-scale raid in August 2025. So while it is difficult to say whether or not the new elections will create a more positive environment for Bangladesh's security in the future, the recent trends and the difficulties currently faced by the government and by the future government after the election definitely point in the opposite direction.
Manfredi, thank you very much for your insights. Coming on to Mark, the growing threat of physical tax on critical infrastructure. I suppose a good starting place for this is, what is the modern definition of critical infrastructure, and why does that matter?
The term critical infrastructure, or CI from henceforth, was institutionalized in 1998 under a US presidential decision, Directive 63, which defined it as the physical and cyber-based systems essential to the minimum functioning of the economy and government. But at the time, that largely referred to traditional sectors such as energy, transport, water, finance, and healthcare. But the modern definition of CI has expanded exponentially, increasingly includes digital infrastructure, such as your data centers, cloud services, communication networks, etc., that underpin almost every other traditional sector. It's now assessed that 70% of modern CI functionality now depends directly on digital systems, meaning that hostile actors no longer need to target a power station or a railway line like they did during the Cold War. They can instead target the digital systems that enable those traditional sectors to function. And this interdependence has created systemic vulnerabilities, and a failure in one area can now rapidly cascade across multiple others, amplifying the potential impact of an attack. And as a result of this, critical infrastructure has become one of the most attractive targets for hostile states, as well as non-state actors seeking to conduct sub-threshold cyber attacks that often result in disproportionate political and economic effects.
What does recent reporting tell us about how threats to infrastructure have evolved?
This is an increasing threat, and pretty much all the reporting illustrates a clear trend towards that. So in November 2025, the US House Committee on Homeland Security issued a report that suggested that 70% of cyber incidents in the US involve critical infrastructure, with the majority being linked to hostile states such as Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. It also stated that AI is increasingly being used as a force multiplier to automate these attacks and scale up operations. And attacks are also increasingly linked to geopolitical developments, probably best evidenced by the surge in cyber attacks against the US's critical infrastructure following US strikes on Iran's nuclear program. And we're seeing comparable patterns in Europe. The UK's National Cyber Security Centre, a branch of GCHQ, reported over 200 nationally significant cyber incidents in 2025, which is double that of 2024. And in Taiwan, Chinese cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure are averaging 2.6 million each and every day. But in response to this has resulted in significant public and private investment in cyber defences. ranging from new legislation all the way to the rise of dedicated cyber 24/7 security operations centers, which can effectively defend from anywhere in the world. The result of this has been that the vast majority of cyber attacks, or at least attempts against critical infrastructure, are now detected, contained, or fail to achieve meaningful impact. And large-scale disruption, although it may hit the headlines, remains relatively rare, with these sort of high-profile successes largely being reflective of the persistence and scale of these attacks rather than any major defensive failures. I think it's well under 1% of cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure actually succeed. More importantly, these cyber attacks should not be viewed in isolation, and they're increasingly nested in the same strategic frameworks or motivated by the same geopolitical tensions as physical attacks, which have also increased markedly in recent years.
And given the trends you spoke about, Mark, why are we seeing a rise in physical attacks on infrastructure, particularly in Europe?
Europe, it's primarily linked to the war in Ukraine. Europe is very exposed to physical sabotage following the end of the Cold War. We have aging infrastructure and underinvestment in physical security as those sort of threats are downplayed, especially when compared to cybersecurity. And Russia has exploited these as part of its broader campaign of hybrid warfare. Now, after hundreds of Russian intelligence officers were expelled from the continent, Russian intelligence services shifted away from traditional espionage towards low-cost, deniable sabotage operations. Now, this has included maritime activity, such as the dragging of anchors over undersea cables. But on land, it's really grown hugely. And Russia has effectively created what's been referred to as a gig economy for sabotage, whereby it recruits proxies online via encrypted platforms to conduct arson and sabotage for small amounts of payment, primarily targeting critical infrastructure and industries linked to Ukraine's military sustainment, such as defense and logistics, which a very recent report came out actually suggesting this is now overstretched law enforcement and intelligence agencies in several countries. Russian-linked sabotage incidents are believed to have tripled between 2023 and 2024. We don't know what 2025 looks like yet, as there's ongoing investigations and challenges of attribution. There may be a slight decrease, but this may be reflective of either reporting delays or simply a temporary recalibration of Russian activity during the political transition associated with the incoming Trump presidency and how he might gauge things reference Ukraine. But I think what's arguably more important than that is this model that Russia has of sabotage and arson is now increasingly being copied by non-state actors and extremist actors, particularly left-wing and environmentalist groups in Europe. We saw coordinated arson attacks on France's rail network during the 2024 Paris Olympics, which resulted in widespread disruption, which has been primarily linked to the far left. And then in 2024 as well, we saw a sabotage of Tesla's Berlin Gigafactory, which demonstrated by targeting a single external dependency, in this case a power pylon, shut down a major industrial facility, resulting in over $1 billion worth of damage without actually breaching the site itself. And then in January of this year, the same far-left extremist network responsible for the Tesla attack claimed an arson attack in Berlin, again targeting a power grid, resulting in power outages for more than 40,000 households and 2,000 businesses in disproportionately affluent areas of Berlin, largely almost certainly by design. So these incidents highlight that physical sabotage can achieve disruption comparable to cyber attacks, often with much lower cost, lower attribution risk, and almost no technical barriers, creating opportunities for low capability actors, increasingly so, unlike cyber attacks, which require fairly advanced technical expertise. And moreover, physical infrastructure is generally much harder to monitor and defend at scale and requires a timely on-the-ground response. I mean, there isn't really a cyber SOC equivalent for infrastructure that crosses thousands of kilometers in many cases. For example, the UK, 22,000 pylons and 7,000 kilometers of overhead lines, almost impossible to effectively defend.
Thanks, Mark. But what is sort of your final closing comments on the forecast for 26?
I think 2026, we'll see that trend increase or continue, even where cyber attacks on CI will continue to increase, with AI increasingly used. But defenses have improved, and defenses will also incorporate AI. which may lead to a sort of equilibrium whereby improved defences largely offset advances in offensive capability. But those physical attacks are so much harder to monitor, but still exploit the same weaknesses, such as poor perimeter security, limited redundancy, and vulnerable external dependencies. And I think Russia's sabotage campaign has essentially provided a blueprint for other actors, and as governments and private operators of critical infrastructure prioritize cyber defenses, I think physical threats are going to be underestimated, and this is going to be exploited. While the scale of Russian attacks is almost certainly going to be dictated by developments in the war in Ukraine, non-Russian linked physical attacks on critical infrastructure, predominantly from left-wing extremists and environmental activists, are likely to proliferate both in Europe and potentially beyond. And there's credible evidence suggesting that traditional protest movements and activity are failing to achieve their goal, resulting in sort of more disruptive and coercive direct action. And I think we're also going to see a change in the industries targeted. So no longer will this be contained to industries linked to the war in Ukraine, but increasingly symbols of perceived environmental harm, economic inequality, corporate power, state authority, etc., whether this be oil and gas companies, banks, affluent neighborhoods, tech firms, etc. And I think that's what we're going to see more of, as we saw only 2 weeks ago in Berlin.
Mark, thank you. We'll wrap it up there, but just go round the panel just as any quick final thoughts. Julian, anything you wanted to add on your area?
Just quickly, there's one thing that I've noticed that reporting hasn't covered much in Yemen, is that it was the UAE's intervention in Yemen that resulted in the defeat of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, effectively. And this is an Al-Qaeda group that has particularly a strong interest in conducting attacks against the far enemy, i.e. the West. So I think that the fact that they used the groups that ended up falling under the SDC to combat AQAP, I think if fragmentation of those forces in the area, that's a longer term risk, but could see a resurgence of their strengths there.
And then correct me if I'm wrong, Julian, we've got a report released just last week on some of these aspects in our Yemen report as well that people can download. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and it goes into a bit more detail.
Thank you. Josh, any final thoughts from yourself?
The expansion of these groups almost certainly raises the risk of potential lone actor attacks in Western countries. Targeting against civilians goes hand in hand with these groups generally, and in the regions where they operate, civilian displacement and food insecurity, as well as the breakdown of basic governance and the stress on the security forces, and by extension the state itself, has almost certainly been exacerbated and will highly likely continue to do so through 2026.
Thanks, Josh.